Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Summer 2021 GES Symposium. Thank you for joining us. Just to note that we're recording today's presentation. So if that's your preference, please turn off your camera if you'd not like to be recorded. Today we have 5 presenters. And this is part of the GS degree requirement. All of our students must do a faculty mentored research experience. They must write a thesis, and then they must present their results to a public audience and take questions and answers. So that's what we're here today to celebrate their efforts. Rules for today's symposium. Please keep your microphone muted at all times unless it is during the Q&A session to answer a question or to congratulate the speakers after they're done with their presentation. Also, please hold all chat window comments until the presentation is completed. After each presentation, there'll be a brief opportunity for everyone to congratulate the speaker by unmuting the microphone, so we'll have a space for that. And then after that brief congratulatory period, I will moderate questions for the speaker from the audience. And you can either unmute your microphone to ask a question, or you can put it in the chat window and I will relay the question to the student speaker. So with that all in mind, we're going to get started. Today's first presenter is Christopher Corpus, and his mentor is Dr. Alison Nugent from Atmospheric Sciences. And she is going to share a few words about Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all. So yes, I worked with Chris Corpus this last year, and his project was trying to answer the question, how much salt makes it up into our rainwater? So you have your waves crashing along the shoreline, the trade winds coming in from the open ocean, how much sea salt aerosol is making it up into the clouds and coming down in the form of rain, or coming down inside the raindrops. So his project today will try to answer that question. How much salts do we find in the rainwater? And he did his analysis from Kāneʻohe. So looking forward to seeing what you all think of that and what questions you have for him.
Thank you, Alison. Chris?
Would you be able to enable the screen sharing?
You should be able to.
Okay. So thank you for the introduction, Alison. So my title is called an analysis of salt concentrations in the rainwaters found in Kāneʻohe, Hawaii. And again, I'm working with Dr. Alison Nugent. So first, we're going to go over some of the objectives of the project itself. The main objective is to gain a more complete understanding of the concentration of sea spray aerosols found in the rainwater of Kāneʻohe, Hawaii, and the changes from day to day due to atmospheric variability. The next objective would be to analyze the influence of environmental factors. So that would be your wind speed, your wind direction, rain rate, etc. On the solute concentrations. And then lastly, it would be to analyze any correlations between the solute concentrations in the samples collected. And on the left, we just have a brief overview of what we'll be going over today. So before we get into it, we're going to kind of look at the processes that make up a big part of our project itself. So on the bottom, we have an image that kind of explains exactly how the process works. So the first image, we can see there's a dust particle. In our case, we're looking more towards sea spray aerosols. So just pretend that's a salt instead. And then the white dot is the water vapor. And these sea spray aerosols, they can be, or they're normally very large, more than 1 micrometer. And that's the case, especially when it's generated by the tearing of the droplets from the top of breaking waves. And these these droplets rapidly grow, and they broaden the cloud droplet size distribution. So that would be on the second part of that image, where you can kind of see the water droplets attaching to that aerosol. And the growth of the water drop, it readily initiates the warm rain processes due to its high hygroscopicity. And so because of that warm rain processes, we want to describe it. And that's what the right side of this this slide shows. So we have the definition of warm rain, which is any rain that's derived from any kind of non-ice phase processes in clouds. And then these warm rain process was formed from condensational growth, which later the coalescence of the water droplets, they broaden the droplet spectrum, and they cause the droplets to fall at a variety of terminal velocities within the clouds themselves. And these clouds, they play a significant role in our local tropical precipitation system, just because it contributes to heating and moistening of the lower troposphere, modifies the stability, and it may alter the recycling timescales of organized tropical convection. And then on our next slide, we're going through a little bit of why it's important. Right now, there's very little known to exactly how much sea salt aerosol or sea spray aerosols make it into the clouds and act as a CCN. And sea spray aerosols, they typically cause accelerated growth in comparison to other aerosols. And so they do play a really big role in local climatology. On the right, our image shows the annual rainfall average. Annual rainfall. And so deeper reds mean a lower amount of rain, and the deeper blues mean a higher amount. So on the windward side, you can see a lot higher rainfall than the leeward side of the island. So next, we're going to go through a little bit of the methodology of our project. So on the right side, we can see the Palmex rain collector, which is what we used for our particular study. So essentially how it works is it's just a funnel, and that funnel collects the rainwater, which drops down through the tube, the internal tube, directly into a sampler bucket. And then there's also an external tube that helps to prevent any kind of condensation or overheating, and ventilation openings just for cooling as well. These samples were collected on a daily basis, and we started in about March 2021, and we ended in around May of this year. And we collected a total of about 41 different rain events and analyzed each one of them. The samples themselves were collected in the bottom image, you can see 3 different color stars. There is a yellow star, which represents the sampling location, which is where the rain bucket was held. The red star represents the HIMB weather station, and the purple star represents the Bellows weather station. And so each of the samples that were collected on the yellow star, they're away from any kind of obstructions, and each day that we brought it out, we made sure that it was disassembled, rinsed with DI water, and put back together even if there was no sample. And on days with samples, we would rinse out each test tube with the sample rainwater, and then put in DI water and rinse that out as well before filling. Next is a little bit of the analysis part. So the image on the right just shows what an ion chromatograph looks like. The 2 towers are the cation and anion element machines. So the one on the left uses anions that separates, uses an anion element that separates the anions before it goes into the second tower, which separates the cations. And these samples were all analyzed at the Water Resource Research Center on UH Mānoa campus. The ion chromatographs were measuring the solute concentrations at ambient temperature, and the results of this analysis were measurements of chloride, nitrate, sulfate, sodium, ammonium, potassium, magnesium, calcium, and there are other ions, but we didn't include it in the figures included on this table because of their minute values. But those specific ions were found in pretty much every rainfall sample. And the accuracy of this instrument was measured on a weekly basis. So because we're located in Kāneʻohe, and obviously Mānoa is a little bit of a drive, we ended up just taking it on a weekly basis, the samples on a weekly basis. And every time we dropped off those group of samples, the lab attendant would run a accuracy measurement. And so that was done on a weekly basis. And for the actual data analysis, we used, ion and weather data sets were analyzed using Python. And because rainwater was sampled at daily intervals, we also had to look at meteorological conditions, such as wind speed, wind direction, and rainfall amount. And the ion concentrations, as well as rain rate, were compared against environmental data from the HIMB and bellows. And hourly wind speed and direction from the weather stations were averaged between the collection times to get an average wind speed and direction during the time that it was actually collected. On this slide, this slide shows like the raw data. Essentially what everything is it's a major ion composition of the rainwater collected. We measured the minimum, maximum, average, and standard deviation of the total rain volume, as well as, total rain mass, as well as the different ions that we found common, which were the fluoride, chloride, nitrogen dioxide, bromide, nitrate, sulfate, sodium, potassium, magnesium, ammonium, and calcium. And on average, we found that the Cl and Na+, which are highlighted in the red boxes, had a very big variance, and they were still very dominant when it came to their ion concentrations in comparison to the other solutes. And on the left, the red box on the left shows the huge variability of total water mass. And that was the 2184 was from that big rain event that flooded Hawaiʻi. And 10.14 was just a dry day in consideration that it's Kāneʻohe. And I think one of the biggest and most important table that we looked at was the correlation table. And that was to help find out the sources of each ion and what they represented. And so that's what our next slide is. It basically shows the different correlations between every significant ion that we found in our rainwater sample. As expected, we found the majority of the ions that were commonly found in seawater, such as like the sodium, chloride, bromide, potassium, and magnesium, and even sulfate. They all hold very strong correlations with each other. And the figure on the top right just shows exactly how strong the correlation between sodium and chloride was. As you can see, it's pretty much a one-to-one line. With it being 0.002 off, it's almost perfect. And it shows a better visual aid. There's also a color bar on the right side, with red being higher rain rate, blue being lower rain rate. And that we didn't really find too much of a correlation, but it was nice to kind of look at, use that color bar to see if there was a correlation. And then on the next slide, we're looking at meteorological comparison and analysis methodology. Before we go into it, we did find that missing data was pretty frequent throughout the ion data set, since not all ions were present in each sample. And so for simplicity's sakes, any kind of missing data was ignored for calculations of averages and correlations. On this slide, or this picture on the right, we're mainly going to be focusing on the top two graphs. The top graph shows like the variability of ion concentrations between sampling days, and the sampling days are measured by are shown by the circle markers on each of the lines, the different color lines. And the lines between them kind of show how the concentrations change from day to day and between rain events for each ion. The values were normalized just because just to show how the concentrations change relative to their minimum and maximum observed value. And the figure B right below, that shows the HIMB weather station rain rate, as well as the calculated rain rate from the sampling location near my home, or actually at my home. And you can kind of see that there is significant variability between the HIMB and our calculated rain rate. And that's just because I feel like in Kāneʻohe specifically, like one part of Kāneʻohe will be very dry and then the other part will be pouring and vice versa. And so we go on to our next slide where we show the wind rose diagrams. And these wind rose diagrams show the 24-hour average wind direction through the angle on the circle itself. And the distance from the middle indicates the 24-hour average wind speed, with the stronger winds being further away from the center. The deeper red color shows higher concentration, and the deeper blue is more of a low concentration. So between the two, we found that trade winds were very common, especially, trade winds are between 45 and 90, but they're very common throughout our study itself. But there were a few outliers with days that had very little winds or they had Kona winds. For chloride, there seems to have very little connection or correlation between the wind speed and direction. But for calcium, it seems that there seems to be a little bit higher of concentrations, especially on days with very little trade winds or weaker winds with the outliers. So like on the bottom left of the image on the right, you can see like the red dots and the light blue dots showing that there's a little higher concentrations from that Kona wind. And just to conclude everything together, on average, we found that the concentrations of Cl and Na remains really dominant, while the other concentrations of ions such as fluoride, bromide, and ammonium were found, but they're in very minute concentrations. And each rainfall sample really had a big variety of ion concentrations, where we would find a really high concentration of an ion on one day, and then the next day there's nothing. Next, we found that sodium and chloride are correlated at nearly a 1-to-1. So that might mean that the main source of the Na and Cl were from marine sources, specifically the top of the breaking waves that make it into the clouds. And the high correlations between the other ions that are typically found in the ocean may mean that that most of the ions are from marine sources. And next, we did notice that there is significant variability in each collection sample and day in comparison to nearby sites. So that was where we talked about in Kāneʻohe, like near my house, it would be dry, and near HIMB, it's pouring. And so we'd have difference in numerical values. And because of that, to improve the study, it'd be a lot better if we could have a rain meter that measures on a more accurate scale. So like hourly, if that was possible, as well as making sure that any kind of collection time is consistent, and having more sampling locations across the island so we can see how it changes as you go further inland or if you go more towards the west side. And that would be it. So just to conclude my presentation, I wanted to acknowledge Dr. Alison Nugent and Katie Ackerman. I think without them, I don't think this study would be complete. And I would also like to thank Catherine at the WRRC, just because she was really helpful and answered all of the questions that we really had, especially on the machines themselves. And I can take any questions.
Great job, Chris. You feel free to unmute if you'd like to congratulate Chris.
Good job, Chris.
Congratulations, Chris.
Good job.
Good.
As Chris said, we'll take questions now. So either you can unmute or you can type your question into the chat box.
Okay, Chris, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
The salinity of seawater is about 35.
Mhm.
Based on your results, what is the salinity of rainwater?
So we didn't, in our specific study, we didn't calculate the exact salinity of rainwater. We just found the different parts per million in the chart found on this slide. Sorry, let me go back on this slide. So each one of these ions were measured in parts per million. And so we didn't measure specifically on that, the salinity of the rainwater that we found.
Okay, well, you've got a column there that says mass. That's mass of what?
Of the water. So it was interchangeable between grams and milliliters, but we just went with total water mass for this specific chart.
Okay, so the average total water mass was 194,
Mhm.
correct? And then you have the grams of the various salts there. So how would you calculate the salinity given that information?
That part I'm not completely sure. I don't think I have an answer to it.
Okay, let me help
Yeah.
you. A salinity of 35 is roughly 35 grams of salt in a liter
Mhm.
of seawater. Now, how much does a liter of seawater, what's the mass of a liter of seawater?
Typically with most waters, it's 1:1 ratio. So you would have 1,000 milliliters or 1,000 grams per liter.
Okay, that's
yeah.
right. So it's roughly 1,000 grams per liter. So
Mhm.
now let me ask you again, you've got how many grams of the various salts there are, and you've got the mass of water. How would you calculate the salinity?
Sorry, give me a second. So I guess it's a little hard because there are in the CLNNA is in parts per million and not in grams itself. So off the top of my head, I'm not too sure on exactly how to calculate it.
Okay. What a part per million? So how many grams is that in the liter?
Sorry, give me 1 second.
I mean, 35 grams per liter is how many parts per million?
That would be third. Sorry, I'm not too sure if it's exact. I'm a little out of it right now.
Well, a part per million is 1 gram in a million grams, right? Okay. So 35 grams in 1,000 grams is how many grams in a million grams?
It'd be 0.0035.
Oh, you're going the wrong way.
Oh, wait.
35 grams in 1,000 grams is how many grams in a million grams?
So 35,000.
Okay. All right. So the average salinity of seawater is 35,000 parts per million.
Mhm.
Okay. So you could convert these numbers and calculate the average salinity of rainwater.
Yeah. it just wasn't specifically done in this this study yet.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Chris, I had a quick question. You're looking at the influence of the wind. Presumably that's as an advective process, bringing the ions to your collection. And but there's also this effect, right, that the wind could be stirring up the sea state and causing more spray to come out. So another way is through the big wave events that we get. Did you look at any of the wave events, or maybe you happen to know off the top of your head if those were storms where you had combination of waves and winds, or is it really just sort of the typical kind of trade wind shower days that we get?
I think throughout our study, there wasn't too many big wave events on the east side of Oahu. I think most of them, actually, yeah, I think most of them were southerly swells or westerly swells in our case. But our weather stations, we didn't really look at the wave height in specific. But I do agree that it might have a significant influence on the sea salt aerosols or sea spray aerosols in the water itself.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions for Chris? Okay, thank you, Chris. All right, our next speaker is Kayla Palmer, and her mentor is Dr. Suwan Shen from the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. Suwan, would you like to say something?
Sure. Kayla Palmer is a student from Fullerton, California. She will become an upcoming urban planning graduate student this fall. Sorry about the background noise. Yeah, so she was originally moved to Hawaii to study marine biology, but became interested in social impact of environmental hazards. Kayla conducted a study to explore how the tidal flooding impacted Oahu's culture and recreational resources using community crowdsourcing data, which is very interesting. She will share the findings with all of you in her presentations.
Thanks. Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, are you guys able to see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, hello, thank you for attending my presentation. Like Suwan said, I'll be graduating with my environmental science degree, and Dr. Suwan Shen was my research advisor, and she's from the Urban and Regional Planning Department. And this project focuses on assessing the impact tidal flooding would have on cultural and recreational locations using crowdsourcing and survey data. All right, so in 2014, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projected that the global average conservative estimate of sea level rise is expected to increase to 0.5 feet in 2030, 1.1 feet in 2050, and all the way up to 3.2 feet in the year 2100. And according to the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation, in 2100 with 3.2 feet of sea level rise, some of the damages include that 3,800 infrastructure or structures will be flooded, 13,300 residents displaced, and 17.7 miles will be flooded. All right. So the impact that sea level rise will have on infrastructure in Oahu has been well documented in research papers. However, there is a lack of research and understanding of how tidal flooding will impact Oahu's cultural and recreational locations. And so this study highlights the impacts that projected 3.2 feet of sea level rise would have on Hawaiian cultural activities along the coast and general outdoor water related recreational activities. And this was done through mapping the photo documentation within the Hawaiian King Tides project and overlaying it with a 3.2 feet passive flooding layer to see what recreational and cultural sites were the most vulnerable to flooding. So the University of Hawaii Sea Grant launched a program titled the Hawaii King Tides Project, and this allowed residents to photo document instances of flooding within their community. And this method of data collection is known as crowdsourcing. In total, there were 1,980 photos of Oahu within 2015 to 2019. And as you can see, this map displays the number of photo documentations within Oahu. But the King Tides project has some limitations as well, because some locations are reported more than others, particularly Honolulu and Maunalua Bay. They have the highest documentations, most likely due to just having a higher population of people there. Okay, so image thematic coding analysis is an analytic technique for analyzing photos and reporting patterns within the data collected. And for this project, 1,980 photos of Oahu were extracted from the King Tides data and organized into Excel. And then photos were coded based on cultural and recreational activities being practiced, and also like the infrastructure that was affected by flooding as well. And so for this image, the road would be heavily impacted by flooding, and this would go under infrastructure. And so after each image was coded from the Hawaiian King Tides project, the photo frequency of each location were overlaid with the 3.2 feet passive flooding layer from PAC-iOS, and map layers from the Hawaii GIS portal were also overlaid to identify additional locations that might have been underreported within the King Tides data. All right. So current flooding conditions display that the Heiau fish pond is already at risk of damage to the flooding barriers in the event, to the fish pond barriers in an event of a heavy flood. And in the left image, you can see that the water level is almost above the barrier and it might cause it to burst. And on the right image, you see that the water is above the walkway. So as you can see, the yellow bars represent the photo frequency of fish pond documentations within the King Tides project within Oahu. The Heiau fish pond has the highest documentation, and the black points represent that there are many underrepresented fish pond locations that were not documented within the King Tides data set. Okay. During heavy rainfall, the canoe can become increasingly difficult to maneuver during high tides, and it can have a higher chance of the canoe capsizing. And in the left image, you can see that the water level within the Alawai Canal is very high. And also in the right image, you see that the water level is really high and that there's a lot of erosion happening. Based on the King Tides photo frequency in yellow, the canoe paddling locations within the southeast of Oahu, such as the Alawai Canal and the beach coast of Maunalua Bay, seem to be the most impacted by sea level rise. And there were no other map layers from the Hawaii GIS portal or Google Maps to do a further analysis to determine if other canoe paddling locations were underreported. So current water levels in both images display that the boating docks are at risk of becoming partially or even fully submerged by water. And as the water level is expected to increase, boating docks will just need to be raised to higher elevations to avoid becoming unusable due to like the water overflowing. And then in yellow, you can see that there's a high photo frequency in Honolulu, Kāneʻohe, Waimanalo, and Maunalua Bay. And it seems that boat harbors are less underrepresented within the King Tides data, except within the North Shore and Northwest regions of Oahu, based on the black points on the map. So beach parks are the center of community building and are home to many recreational activities, and many of the beach parks in Oahu were negatively impacted by direct marine flooding. Current flooding conditions based off the pictures led many beach parks to suffer from coastal erosion and less shoreline for the beachgoers to practice recreational activities. And so in the left, you can see that the water level has reached almost to the stairs. And then on the right, the water level has reached the wall. In yellow, it shows the photo frequency of Honolulu and Maunalua Bay. And these locations had the highest documentations within the King Tides project. And then the Hawaii GIS portal implies that in black that there are other beach parks locations within the northeast and west side of Oahu that were most likely underdocumented within the King Tides data. And this is just likely due to having a higher population and just more use of the Honolulu and Maunalua Bay regions. Okay, as a result of tidal flooding, a lot of the storage locations for the surfboards have been affected. And there's also just a lot of erosion that you can see in the pictures as well. And then the Honolulu region has the highest photo documentations within the King Tides data due to having a higher population of this region. And then the north and west regions were underreported within the data set. Okay, so the second part of this thesis, so crowdsourcing from the King Tides data helped us better understand what locations and activities people were most concerned about, but it didn't tell us people's opinions about adaptations and sea level rise adaptations. And so that's why we used a community survey. And so an online survey was done to overcome the limitations of the data. And in total, 37 respondents fully completed the survey, which provided more insight to the preferred sea level rise adaptation methods and also cultural and recreational practices within each region. And then out of the 37 respondents, 11 were urban planners and scientists, 15 were UH Manoa students. There was one neighborhood board member and 10 urban environmental nonprofits. And some of the questions included information about frequency of flooding, what were their preferred adaptations, and then what cultural and recreational activities were practiced in each region. And then from one being the least acceptable and 5 being the most acceptable rating, survey respondents favored adaptations such as monitoring and modeling climate risks, the soft shoreline, and also the soft shoreline approach rather than hardening shorelines. And that has the lowest rating, most likely due to increasing the coastal erosion of adjacent beaches. And then when rating what region of Oahu needed the most adaptation, 70% of survey participants selected the primary urban center for the highest region in need for adaptation. And then the North Shore region did not have a high photo documentation within the King Tides data, but however, within the survey, it was selected as the second in most need for adaptation to sea level rise. And this just highlights that more studies will need to be conducted to assess the impacts of sea level rise for Oahu. In conclusion, the primary urban center was the most documented for sea level rise in the King Tides data, and soft adaptation methods are most preferred over hard methods. And then there were some variations of the photo frequency in the King Tides data, and this is most likely due to higher population and more usage of the site. And then it could also be that certain sites are more frequently or severely impacted by flooding. And survey data may be under or overrepresented depending on the survey participants' residence and what region they live in. And then the advantage of the king tides data is that it displayed the details of the type of impact occurring. So that was good. And then also a further analysis will just need to be conducted to get more detailed information about underreported regions in Oahu. All right, and that's the end of my presentation. Oh, and my acknowledgements. So Dr. Suwan Shen is my thesis advisor, Dolan Eversole, who reviewed my thesis, and then Dr. Guidry and Latina, who are my advisors. Okay.
Thank you, Kayla. Great
Yeah,
job.
thank
Feel free
you.
to unmute if you'd like to congratulate her.
Congrats, Kayla.
Congratulations.
Congrats,
Kayla.
Kayla.
Okay, we have time for some questions. So either unmute to ask or you can type in the chat window.
Okay, Kayla, I have a question for you. First of all, I do want to congratulate you on a very nice talk, and also getting through all that material in 15 minutes. I think that you really did a nice job of highlighting the important parts of the work. Now, sea level rise. Sea level has been rising and presumably will continue to rise. Why is it rising?
So it's rising because I believe the glaciers are not, the land ice from Antarctica is melting into the ocean. And then Hawaii is, it's in a tropical region. So I guess like there's a lot of thermal expansion of the water, I believe. And so that's why like Hawaii will need to adapt faster to sea level rise. But if I missed anything, please let me know.
That's
Okay.
right. And up until now, about half the sea level rise has been due to thermal expansion of the ocean. The other half is melting of continental ice. It's not just the ice on Antarctica, but okay, the big looking ahead, what really concerns environmentalists is the ice on Greenland. And you may have seen some articles in the news just recently about the stability of the Greenland ice sheet. If we actually melt all the ice on Greenland, how much will sea level rise?
I'm not sure, but a lot. I'm assuming.
Well, that's a lot. Let's see, you're projecting what, 1/2 meter rise into the end of this century? Is that right?
Yeah, 3.2 feet. I think that might be.
Oh, okay.
Meter.
Okay, 3.2
I
feet.
don't know.
So
I don't know the conversion.
Yeah, no, that's roughly a meter. Okay. Yeah, if you melt all the ice in Greenland, it's about 22 feet. So do you have any idea how long we expect it may take for all the ice on Greenland to melt?
No, I don't. That's a good question for next time. But do you know how long it will take?
Well, it's a question that we're not sure what the answer is. But you know, it depends on whether the ice just slowly melts and the water flows into the ocean, or if the Greenland ice sheet becomes unstable and starts to slough off, you know, big hunks of ice just go shooting into the ocean. So the estimates are 500 to 1,000 years.
Oh, wow.
So it's nothing that, unless you're planning on living for a very long time, it's nothing that you have to worry about, nothing that I have to worry about, but it's 22 feet when all that ice melts. Okay, again, congratulations. I think you did a very nice job.
Thank you.
I have a question, Kayla.
Yeah.
So you mentioned about the number of respondents to your survey. What, if anything, would you do differently next time to try to get more respondents?
Yeah, so most of my respondents were from they're mostly from the primary urban center. And so maybe we contacted each of the survey respondents through email. And so maybe trying to do something in person to like get them to respond, or going to more locations that would have less respondents would help. But maybe doing flyers. But yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. Okay, any other questions for Kayla? All right, great job, Kayla.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So Han Quach is our next speaker, and her mentor is Dr. Jim Potemra from the Hawaii Institute of Geophysics and Planetology. Jim?
Great, thanks, Michael. So I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Wat Nok Kyung, and she has been researching marine debris deposition here in Hawaii, and I'm sure we're all aware of this this problem and how it has serious consequences, not only to the environment, but also to human health and safety in terms of navigation and so forth. And of course, the economy, because we're, as we all know, driven by tourism here in the state. And sadly, here in Hawaii, we do see some of the highest accumulation rates of marine debris in the United States. And this issue of marine debris is something that Horace Riddle had called a so-called wicked problem. And that's not because Horace Riddle is from Boston. He meant by that this is a difficult problem to track, because usually we need to know where the debris originates and or where it ends up, and then the pathway that it takes to get there. But usually the data sets that we're dealing with marine debris is we only know either where it starts in for example, in the case of an extreme thing like the tsunami we saw a while ago out of Japan, or we know where it ends up. And so Han's been curious about connecting these dots and looking at debris accumulation here in the state, and I look forward to seeing her talk.
Hey, thank you, Jim, for that introduction. Jim did mention that we have one of the highest, historically, we have one of the highest accumulation of marine debris on Oahu, in Hawaii. And why is that? Well, it could be because of our location. So what you're looking at right now is a cartoon version of the Pacific. We have Asia on your left and North America on your right. And in the middle, we have the North Pacific Ocean. And within it, there is this large-scale circulation called the Subtropical Convergence Zone right here. And within it, there are 3 areas of accumulation, or convergence zones. So we have the West Pacific Garbage Patch, the Eastern Pacific Garbage Patch, and the Subtropical Convergence Zone that links them together. And right here, we have Hawaii. So how do debris from here get to us? Well, there we have trade winds that blow from the northeast, represented here by these solid arrows. And there is this prevailing theory that our trade winds are the main drivers of transporting marine debris from these convergence zones to Hawaii. Now, based on that speculation, we would expect to see the windward side of our islands to only have debris, and also in a even manner, and our leeward side to have no debris. However, that does not seem to be the case. Ooh, sorry. In 2018, a survey put out by Moy et al. Was put out by Moy et al. To look at the detrital aftermath of the Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that happened in Japan in 2001. What you're looking at right now is the end product of their aerial survey. So basically what they did was fly these drones over the coastlines of all 8 main Hawaiian islands. They took pictures of them, and then they counted what they could see from their drones in their pictures. And at the end of their survey, which lasted from August to November of 2015, they added it all up and create this density maps, which you're looking at right now. So this is the number of debris items found per 1 mile segment of the coastline, and this is for Oahu. On your right, you have the legend of what all the colors mean, from light gray meaning no debris found to dark red meaning 75 items or more found. And what I wanted you to take away from this figure is the patchiness that's happening, and by patchiness I mean different concentration of debris are existing next to each other relatively closely, and I've highlighted these 4 areas because they show that quite a lot, but you can see that it's happening throughout the island as well, which leads me to my research question, and that is, what is responsible for the uneven distribution of marine debris on Oahu? Now, this is my overarching question for my research, but I wanted to break it down to 2 smaller separate questions. The first one being, can the deposition rate be based on the long-term seasonal mean of the current flow? This question is important because within science, the average can tell us the behavior of something. It allows us to make predictions and draw conclusions, and I want to see if those same principles apply to my research. This is the long-term mean current flow of January. I made this using the output of the regional ocean modeling system, the main Hawaiian Islands, and this is the mean of 9 years. When you're looking at now, it's called a streamline plot, where each line represents the current. The arrows indicate the direction in which the current is flowing in, and the color is the speed at which the currents are floating at, which can be referenced down here at the color bar. So if we were to use this to make any kind of predictions on the destination of incoming debris from the northeast, we would expect it to all not make landfall and just to flow towards the northwest. To test my hypothesis, I used a program called Ocean Parcels, which is a set of Python classes that lets you run highly customizable particle tracking simulation. It uses the outputs of ocean circulation models as the flow field to evaluate these things called particles on. Now, particles can mean many things, but in our case, it's used to represent a piece of debris regardless of shape or size. And the output data I used were both from the PACA-UPS data server. For the currents, I used, again, the ROMS model for the main Hawaiian island with a spatial resolution of 4 kilometers and a temporal resolution of 3 hours, and a constant depth of 0.25 meters, which is fully submerged, but is still very surface level. And for the tides, I used the tide model with a spatial resolution of 1 kilometer and a time resolution of 1 hour. And I also use it at a constant surface level depth. For the sake of time, I will only be talking about the Januaries of 3 different years. The first one being January 2014. So this is what's called a forward trajectory run with a delayed release. So these black stars that you're seeing are the release point of my particles, and every 3 hours for the first 10 days of the month, a particle would be released, and it will travel with the currents until the simulation ends. So can the mean explain what's going on here? No, you can see that these particles are making landfall, and this kind of blob shape you're seeing with it is the current switching direction somewhere along these 10 days. Well, what about January 2015? This is a little bit more promising. There is a kind of flowing, the particles are kind of flowing towards the northwest, and it's kind of curving around like we are seeing in the mean, but there is this back part that we do not see in the mean. Well, what about 2016? No, these particles are heading straight onto shore, and we're also seeing this switching of the currents again, and there is this downward movement that we don't see at all in the mean. So can the deposition rate be based on the long-term seasonal mean current flow? No, it doesn't seem to be that way, at least based on my results. And which brings me to my second question. What are the roles that currents and tides play in depositing marine debris? For these sets of experiments, I did what's called a backwards trajectory run, where I've moved the starting points from offshore to along the shore, essentially mimicking the coastline. The simulation ran for the first 10 days of the month with the hopes of understanding where a piece of debris came from. These lines that you're seeing is called a trajectory path, which is generated by the simulation to show the path in which the particles took before they make their destination, which is represented by the red stars that you're seeing. Again, sticking with January's, it looks like the majority, if not all the debris on the windward side and a little bit on the south shore and the northwest are coming from the east in this group. And the debris on the leeward side from Kāneʻohe Point to down here seem to not be moving around at all, except for these two rebel particles that came from the west. And then the south shore, we see this sort of turning. The debris aren't really going anywhere, they're kind of just there. And I'm assuming those are because of eddy activities, but I'm not sure. And what I want you guys to take away from this slide is that our surface currents are very greatly, which means that they have the potential to transport debris from various origins. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to show you January. Oh, my bad. I'm sorry. Now looking at January 2015 and 2016, you can see the trajectory lines are coming from a wide variety of directions. And now what I want you to get from this slide is that our surface currents vary greatly. The origins of the debris can also vary greatly as well. Now we're going to look at the tidal influence. Since tides don't vary much between years seasonally, I just looked at 1 year, that is 2021, and we looked at different months within the year. These all ran for the same parameters as the currents. It's just now I'm using tidal data. For the most part, the tides are much more consistent than the currents. There are some variability with the tide, most noticeably with this blue particle that you see in February and March, but you don't see in January. But overall, you can rely on the tide to be the ones moving the particles back and forth along the shore. Okay, so what have we learned? We learned that one, it doesn't seem that the long-term seasonal mean can be used to draw conclusions or prediction for the destination of incoming debris. And two, currents are responsible for transporting debris on and offshore, while tides are the ones moving the debris back and forth along shore. Now, how does this play into my overarching research question? Well, based on my results, I have reasons to believe that the high spatial and temporal variability of surface currents do play a hand in the uneven distribution of marine debris along our shores. And with that, with those concluding thoughts, I would like to thank my mentor, Jim Potemra. I couldn't have done this without you. I'd also like to thank my partner, Sean Riston, for always being there for me. I would also thank Tobias, Fernanda, and Noah for being part of the review process, and especially Fernanda and Noah for sitting through that very rough practice run. I'd like to thank Angeles for always making time to help me with my script. My angel on earth, Lisa Harberger, and of course, Michael, Guidry, and Lentina for being there to keep me on track. And last but not least, friends and family who have supported me and encouraged me throughout the whole process. And of course, thank you to everyone who has listened. And now I will be taking questions.
Good job, Han. Feel free to unmute. Congratulator.
Congrats, Han.
Congratulations.
Congrats, Han.
Good job, Han.
Congratulations.
Let's go, Han.
Okay, questions for Han?
Okay, Han, I have a question for you. When you showed those figures, you indicated that the debris was coming from the east. there was a paper published just a few months ago, I think in Science Magazine, that concerned where the plastic debris in the ocean was coming from. And this was broken down by countries. Do you have any idea what countries are the chief offenders in terms of putting plastic debris into the ocean?
I believe one of them is I think India. I'm assuming I think the US too, or we produce a lot of plastic, but I'm not sure how much is that is getting into the ocean.
Okay, well, believe it or not, the US is not one of the major offenders. Apparently, the US does a pretty good job of recovering, recycling, whatever. It turns out, according to this article, that the chief offender is the Philippines, which I would not have guessed, but the first 5 or 6 countries in terms of the magnitude of plastic waste introduced in the ocean are all in Southeast Asia. China is one of them. I think Vietnam is one of them. Indonesia is definitely one of them. So so it's not coming from the United States. So if all of this stuff in the North Pacific is basically coming from Southeast Asia, is any of it washing up on the beaches in Hawaii? And if so, how does it get there?
So we're talking about Asia. Well, I did mention the tsunami that happened in Japan, and this MOI study that I kind of used as a reference for my own study looked at the debris aftermath of that. And I guess in terms of studying the origins of marine debris, it's really hard because it's hard to, one, figure out exactly where they came from, how old they are, how long they've been on the shore. And there's a huge variety of ways they can come here, whether it's—
Okay, well, let's look at that graph you showed of the garbage patches.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yeah, okay. Now you look at that and you look at Southeast Asia. How could that debris find its way to Hawaii?
I'm assuming through this large-scale current circulation.
You're definitely showing some currents there.
Yeah, so the Kuroshio current, the North current, and then I guess the California current. So maybe it's getting washed up in here, it's finding its way into the subtropical convergence zone, and then these processes I've mentioned earlier could bring them here.
That's correct. So you mentioned, how long. It's not a short trip, but see, if we're talking about plastics, we're talking about something that is, for the most part, not biodegradable. So
Right.
that stuff is capable of traveling long distances over a long period of time. And actually, some of this material has been traced to its origin, and most of it comes from the Western Pacific, interestingly. And it goes for a long ride on those currents, and starting out with the Kuroshio current. Now, let me ask you a hypothetical question. If you went out on a UH research vessel, could you dump waste into the ocean off the research vessel?
To study it or just to litter?
No, just because you wanted to get rid of it.
No, I wouldn't. But I do know that a lot of the vessels, I think, deposit their restroom waste, because it's just organic matter and toilet paper. It's what I've heard from one source. But
Okay.
personally, I wouldn't throw my plastic fork overseas.
Okay, is there any legislation that would prevent you from doing that?
I don't know. I just, yeah, there's you can't litter here, I'm assuming. Can you? You can't litter in Singapore. I know that, but I'm not sure about the ocean or any of that.
Okay, well, I've been around for a while, and on my first research cruise, I distinctly remember throwing, not me, but somebody throwing the trash in a plastic bag off the stern of the boat. And there was absolutely nothing to prevent you from doing that back in the good old days. Now there's an international piece of legislation now, the acronym is MARPOL, which is a short for marine pollution. But that legislation absolutely prohibits throwing plastic off into the ocean. You can't do it. Now you can dump other types of waste into the ocean if you're far enough from shore. And I distinctly also remember going out on a University of Hawaii research cruise some years ago. And as soon as we got very far from land, boom, you know, the waste that had accumulated while the boat was tied up at the dock went into the ocean. So it's an interesting story, you know, where this stuff comes from. But today, a lot less of it is apparently coming from research, well, not research vessels, from vessels, period. And according to this article, a lot of the plastic waste is coming from rivers, particularly in Southeast Asia. Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I could just follow up real quick, I think Dr. Laws is right. But, you know, another big source of the plastic that we're seeing is coming from the ghost nets. And these are the fishing industry. And the problem there, again, this is, we think, Southeast Asian origin. And the problem is it's still cheaper to just, if you have a problem, just cut your net loose and let it float away than to bring it back to shore. So again, there's a lot of issues here and problems for sure, but we're getting there. Thanks to brilliant young minds like Han.
Han, one more question. This is from Eric. I'll read it for you. Is there a reason why you chose January for the current comparisons? And do you think your results might have been different if you had picked other times of the year?
Hi, thank you for the questions. The question, Eric. I did look at all 12 months of all 3 years, but because of time constraint, I only chose to show 1 month, January. But based on what I've seen with my results, the same kind of unpredictableness and high variability exists throughout all the months. And yeah, and I don't think my results would have differed if I chose a different month.
Great,
All
thank
right.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I'm in the car right now, so I don't
No
know.
worries. Thanks for being here.
Great job.
Okay, great job, Han. We're going to move to our next speaker now. So our next speaker is Sienna Santiago, and her mentor is Dr. Michael Cooney from the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute.
Hello, I'm working with my phone here, so I'm going to share my screen.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, never mind.
Yep, can hear you, Michael.
Yeah, we can hear you, Michael.
Okay. So hang on, Sienna, I'm going to introduce you, or you probably can't hear me. So before Sienna starts, so Sienna came to us about 4 years ago from San Diego. She studied, well, she came to GES because she loved environmental science in high school. It was her favorite subject. And maybe most of you don't know this, but Sienna was actually an athlete. She was on the cross-country team. And so that probably explains how she's able to cover so much land in this Pacific Crest Trail in such a short time. I've been on sections of it. San Jacinto, Mount Giorno down around LA, Sierra Nevada, John Muir Trail, and around Mount Shasta. So I can tell you she's hiking a long ways in some pretty serious terrain. So that makes sense. Anyways, Sienna with me was working on a project with Matt Lynch and others in the Office of Sustainability about tracking the environmental footprint of the UH campus, which has a lot of contributions. We're talking carbon, nitrogen, water footprint in particular for all kinds of activities. And the one that Sienna focused on specifically was food. So the food consumption on campus. So I'll let Sienna take it from here, but that's what she's presenting. So good job, Sienna, and it's yours. Take it away.
Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Cooney. I'll start sharing my screen now. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? I won't be able to see the Zoom while I present this.
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So, hello, welcome to my undergraduate thesis presentation. Like Dr. Cooney said, I will be talking about our process of calculating the University of Hawaiʻi Mānoa's food procurement environmental footprint. So the goal of this work was to calculate the nitrogen and carbon emissions, as well as the water withdrawals caused by the food that UH serves at their 3 campus cafeterias. These are the emissions and water withdrawals related to the growing, raising, transportation, and preparation of food. Throughout this presentation, I will share the relevance, methods, and results of my thesis, as well as show how the university compares to other universities. And at the end, I will offer some suggestions to reduce UH's footprint. So environmental footprinting is a way to account and track the quantities of emissions into the environment that an entity, such as UH, is responsible for due to activities like the procurement of food. The footprints I specifically tracked was the nitrogen footprint and the carbon footprint, which represent the total nitrogen and carbon emissions to the environment due to food procurement from the Sodexo cafeterias. I also calculated the water withdrawal footprint, which is the amount of fresh water withdrawn from the environment. Tracking the emissions that our specific university is responsible for is important because it allows us to designate responsibility and encourage accountability by the university. It sheds light onto which activities cause the most harm to the environment. In this case, which food categories contribute the most to UH's environmental footprint. And it also allows us to aggregate the results into a family of pressure indicators caused by the university. Pressure indicators such as greenhouse gas emissions and global warming caused by carbon, disruption of the nitrogen biogeochemical cycle, such as nutrient pollution and eutrophication from increased fertilizer use, degradation of the water cycle, disruption of the water cycle, excuse me, and degradation of ecosystem function and transgression of planetary boundaries like biodiversity loss and desertification, which can be seen on the image on the right. And because of these environmental impacts, the food procurement footprint of a community the size of UH is critical to understand and track. So understanding the relevance of this project led me to my specific research question for this thesis, which was, what foods from food procurement contribute the most to UH's environmental footprint? The data for this project was collected by Sherelle Hugh and can be seen as the image on the left. This picture is just a small example of what the data looks like. There are actually 527 different food items that I worked with. And this data represents the specific food procured for the campus by weight in kilograms. To allow for efficient footprint calculations, I broke down each of the 527 food items into their 3 most common ingredients. For example, 81 kilograms of whole grain muffin was broken down into its 3 common ingredients of wheat, sugar, and butter. Each ingredient was then placed into one of its 18 food categories, seen as the second image. So wheat was placed into the grains category, and sugar into the sugar category, and butter into the dairy category. These food categories were created to ensure that all foods were accounted for, but not double counted. After the food items were broken down into their respective food categories, I could work on calculating the environmental footprint for each individual food category. So there are many calculations that go into converting foods into emissions. It got quite complicated, so this is a very simplified version of it. The calculations were the bulk of the analytical portion of this work, however, so for a more detailed explanation, I'd recommend reading my thesis. Essentially, for all 3 of the environmental footprints, I took the associated emissions and water withdrawal caused by growing, raising, transportation, production, processing, and even the nitrogen contained within the foods, and multiplied these associated emissions by the weight of the food procured at the university. This resulted into 3 different environmental footprints for each food category. So a nitrogen footprint, a carbon footprint, and a water footprint, all for the grains category, and etc. Then the nitrogen footprint for each food category was added together to create a total nitrogen footprint. The same was done for carbon and water, and this results in total 3 footprints for UH, which then we can use to start to define the aggregated environmental footprint for the food procurement at UH. Now, before I show any of the footprint results, I think it's important to show each food category by the amount of it procured on campus. So in this graph, we can notice how beef only represents 3.2% of the food procured in the cafeterias. Grains is the blue slice, and that represents 16.3% of the total food procured. And these values are, as you'd expect, spread out pretty evenly. Grains are common in most meals, beef is less common, so therefore grains is a larger percentage. Now, you would think that the resulting footprint should look similar. However, the results are not that linear. For the nitrogen footprint, we see that beef in orange makes up over a quarter of the total footprint. And this is the same beef that represented only 3.2% of the entire procurement, implying that its impact is quite large. The next largest contributors were pork and grains, which you can see as the red and blue triangles. Grains make sense as to why it's such a large player in the nitrogen footprint. After all, it was the most consumed food category on campus. And grains, unfortunately, require a lot of fertilizer with nitrogen to grow. Pork, however, only made up 4.6% of the university's cafeteria consumption, but it produced more nitrogen than almost all of the other food categories in the cafeteria. Moving on to the carbon footprint, the results, similarly to nitrogen footprint, aren't as linear to the amount of the food procured as we would expect. Here, beef makes up a huge percentage, 32% of the carbon footprint, while still only representing 3.2% of the food procured. Cheese, the next largest contributor, is seen as the purple triangle, and it only makes up 4.2% of the food procured, but represents such a large portion of the carbon footprint. And pork, is the 3rd largest contributor, making up just under 12% of the carbon footprint. In total, these 3 food categories make up 59% of the entire carbon footprint, while only representing 12% of the food procured. The final footprint I calculated was the water withdrawal footprint, and sticking with the current trend, beef was the largest contributor to this footprint, representing 16% of it, significantly more than any of the other contributions. The second largest contributor was liquids in light orange, which made up 10.9% of the total footprint, with dairy following closely behind at 10. Oh, I put that arrow in the wrong spot. So, I'm sorry, at 10.5%, which is the olive colored triangle, not the purple. Unlike beef, however, liquids and dairy made up fairly large portions of the total procurement, with liquids being the 2nd most procured food category on campus and dairy being the 3rd, indicating that although liquids and dairy represent a large portion of the water footprint, it's more justifiable than beef because of their large procurement. So after analyzing the results from the 3 footprints, we can conclude that beef, pork, and cheese are the food categories that contribute the most to UH's food procurement environmental footprints. Beef was the #1 contributor for all 3 of the footprints. This can be seen on the right, where beef is orange and represents a significant portion of each of the bar graphs. Pork is red, and although not the 2nd largest contributor for all 3 of the footprints, it represents the 2nd largest contributor in aggregate. Similarly to pork, cheese is 3rd overall due to its significant contribution to each footprint. In total, these 3 food categories represent 58% of the nitrogen footprint, 59% of the carbon footprint, and 32% of the water footprint, while only representing 12% of the food served at cafeterias, indicating that despite these 3 food categories being consumed Pretty infrequently, they are responsible for almost half of UH's food procurement environmental footprint. And this makes these three categories sensible targets for reducing the university's environmental footprints. Many universities around the country are taking steps to be more sustainable. Schools like the University of California, San Diego have effective committed initiatives that are determined to reduce their emissions, not only in the food sector, but in almost all campus activities and operations. Compared to universities like UCSD, who have rigid food procurement goals, UH is behind the times with no specific emission reducing campaigns and with a much larger environmental footprint. Here I have listed some of the ways that the university can reduce its food procurement footprint. The most effective mitigation strategy with the most immediate impact would just to be completely to remove beef from the cafeteria menus. This would allow the university to reduce its environmental footprint by huge margins. And beef only represents 3.2% of the total food consumed, but it is the largest food category of the university's footprints. And it just makes it such an inefficient ingredient to serve on campus. The second and perhaps more realistic option is to implement meatless Mondays, where one day a week, no beef, pork, or chicken is served. This is also a very effective option that is popular for universities across the country. The final option is the general reduction of animal products on campus through creating campus initiatives encouraging food awareness. Initiatives such as Menus of Change, which shares that changing menus is an effective way to improve the planet, or the Real Food Challenge, which encourages creating a food system that is sustainable and beneficial for everyone. To conclude, the university needs to make a dietary shift away from beef and other animal products to reduce its environmental footprint, and to take a proactive stance to actively reduce its harm to the environment. This will become increasingly important for future changes regarding the university and the state's environmental goals. Tracking environmental footprints will also become increasingly relevant as the need to improve and ensure food security increases. Before I end my presentation, I wanted to give a big thank you to my mentor, Dr. Michael Cooney, my project partner, Caleb Montanona, my other mentor, Matthew K. Lynch, and the Office of Sustainability, and as well as the Global Environmental Science Department for making this experience possible. Lastly, here are my references. I will now be able to answer any questions you may have.
Feel free to unmute if you'd like to congratulate.
Nice job, Sienna. Good job,
Sienna.
Good job.
Good job, Sienna.
Good job, Sienna.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good job, Sienna. Very interesting. Questions from the audience?
Okay, Sienna, I have a question for you. I gather from Mike's introduction that you are an environmental science major. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, beef is not the most efficient way to get the job done, but so an alternative obviously is to be a vegetarian and not eat meat, and no beef, no pork, no meat. So why is there any reason to object to being a vegetarian?
It depends, I think, how you look at it. From the perspective of just viewing the environmental footprint, you could object to grains, because grains did have because if you were to go just full vegetarian, you're likely to eat more grains. Grains did have quite a large impact on the footprint for the campus, especially on the nitrogen footprint due to fertilizer use and stuff. That you could object to the increased use of grains that would have to replace your meat consumption, since I think technically meat would be calorically higher, so you would have to eat more grains. But
okay, now you mentioned calories there. That's that's not the big objection. Let's think of this from a nutritional standpoint. From a nutritional standpoint, what's the downside of not eating meat and fish, let's say?
some people believe that it's difficult to get certain protein and
Yes, that's the answer.
nutritional values.
It's you absolutely have to get your protein. There are people in the world who are experiencing serious health problems because they don't get enough protein. So that's the issue. If you tell people, well, I'm sorry, we're not going to serve meat on this campus, or maybe not even meat and fish, there's a real issue with protein. Do you know what the best source of protein is for humans?
I don't know what it is for humans in general, no.
Okay. Okay, it's actually eggs. And after that is fish. So it turns out that the beef is not the best source of protein. And if you're willing to eat eggs, which if you're a real serious vegetarian, you won't. But if you're willing to eat eggs and fish, those are both very good sources of protein. So we could just stop serving pork and beef on campus and serve a lot of eggs and fish and still give people adequate nutrition in terms of their protein.
I do agree. I actually am a vegetarian, and like Dr. Cooney said, as a vegetarian, didn't struggle to get my protein even as a student athlete at UH. So I believe that it's a solution that would still work for the campus.
Well, the fact is there's some, I think, Olympic athletes who have been vegetarians. And so it's possible, but you have to be very careful about what you eat to get your protein if you're not going to eat meat. Okay, good job.
Thank you.
Hey, Ed, you do know some of the athletes that are like Tom Brady that are going into their playing to their 45. They're all vegan. They swear by it as the diet to actually allow them to play longer. So there's increasing evidence that a vegan diet is actually very healthy.
Yeah,
for sports athletes.
It's interesting, and that some well-known people are doing that, and that gets the message out there that you can actually get your protein, and you don't have to eat Big Macs.
Yeah, they're getting like whey protein supplements, things like that from dairy.
And I have a question. So with regards to the beef impact, so carbon, nitrogen, water, are the grains and the water that are necessary for these large industrial operations that produce beef on the scale that we're using, did you take into account the grains and the water into that beef's environmental footprint?
Yes, I believe so. So the data that I used took I took like commonly used values of 1 pound of beef is worth this much carbon, nitrogen, water. And so I just use those commonly used values from different literature that I've read, and they do account for the different things that go into raising a cow. So that's why beef has such a high impact in each of those values, is because for each of the footprints, because yes, beef requires a lot of water, requires a lot of grain to grow, and in that transfer of energy, the trophic levels, not a lot of energy is transferred. So
So that's the key point here, is the industrial scale operation and what it required. But what about pasture or regenerative agriculture beef? What is that beef's footprint? And is that an answer potentially to provide a different solution to this, if you know what the footprint is for that type of beef that's raised in those ways?
like, are you referring to like free range beef and stuff like that?
Sure. Yeah, free range, regenerative agriculture, because the footprints of that beef is very different. It's also very restorative for the land. We need grazers on the land for the land to do its thing and be healthy. So I'm just curious, do you know anything about what's the relative difference in the footprints between the two? Pound of beef from industrial versus a pound of beef from, pasture raised.
I don't have that number off the top of my head. I think some of the literature I used did compare that, but it mostly focused on an average of farm use just based on what we use a lot nowadays, like what is commonly used, which would not be this regenerative farming. I don't think it's a super common practice yet. So I don't know exactly what the comparison would be, but I imagine that if it is restorative to the land and it's done in a more efficient way, you're not losing so much to extra like farm practices.
Well, you're not having to raise the grain, which is really intensive for both water, and it's very, generates a lot of pollution, not just the footprint itself. Yeah. And that's the problem with kind of Bill Gates, what he's trying to do, trying to mass produce fake meat. Where does the fake meat come from? It comes from mass production of grain. So that's a sort of from the frying pan into the fire.
So Sienna, the answer is they don't count the grains, as Michael was pointing out. If it's free range, you just don't incorporate the grains into the calculation.
And the water. Because so he's right. Bill Gates, this is a really the guy must be promoting a business, because it doesn't make sense to try to recreate beef from grains, because you're still going to have this big waste. The idea is just to eat less meat and get down on the trophic level. But it's not, and to go back to what Ed said, it's not to kill, it's not to take meat totally out of everybody's diet. It's to reduce the amount of beef we keep eating, because most of us in the Western world are overeating beef. We don't need to eat nearly as much as we do to be healthy. So the free range would just restrict the amount, it would just raise the prices so people would eat less. You just have it diced up in your pasta instead of big chunks, that kind of thing.
I agree. I think that's why, although my first recommendation I listed on that one slide was to remove beef, that I don't think that is like the most sustainable solution for like people as a whole. But in regards to UH's just the literal environmental footprint that we're dealing with at UH, I think it is still like a temporary option or an option.
Well, Sienna, I want to follow up on a comment there that Mike made, and you mentioned calories as an issue. So both Mike and Mike said that, herbivores are very inefficient in converting what they eat into biomass. And, just because an ear of corn doesn't look like a steer or a pig, it's very different. So going from vegetables to beef is a very inefficient step in the food chain. And so people have sat down with a pencil and paper and looked at, if the world population is going to be 10 billion, which is what they're projecting, could we feed 10 billion people with enough calories if people eat beef and pork, et cetera, the way people in the United States do? And the answer is no. There's no way, because it's such an inefficient step from vegetables to beef that you're throwing away most of the calories, just taking that first step. So the conclusion is that unless people are going to start starving to death, if we're going to feed 10 billion people, people have to eat a lot more vegetables and less beef and pork than people in the United States do. And so the concern is that these, third world countries, or even places like China, they want to be like the United States. They want to eat Big Macs. I mean, if you go to China, which I have, and you say KFC, they know what you're talking about. And so there's, this mindset that let's be like the United States and eat a lot of meat. That can't happen. It's just impossible. Now, whether the United States changes its ways, remains to be seen, but the whole world can't be like the US in terms of meat consumption.
Definitely.
Ed, I want to add that if the world tried to, even if we try to we have to tear down all these forests and grasslands to even grow the grains. And the damage we're going to do to the carbon cycle in terms of CO2 sequestration and climate change is extraordinary. In fact, ensure we're going to have as many grasslands as areas that we can actually grow crops. There's going to be around the globe just due to climate change. So there's so many other factors, and I just think it's dangerous to even try to support 10 billion people on meat. I think we'll just destroy every ecosystem we need to help regulate the climate. That's an aside.
I agree, Mike. I think you're right. The Easter Islanders found out the hard way what happens when you cut down all the trees.
Yeah, and Brazil's going to find out too with losing those rivers in the sky from the Brazilian rainforest.
Yep.
Anyway, Sienna, that was a really good presentation. I must say, much improved over your first drafts, and it was a first-class presentation as far as I'm concerned. I wanted to say that.
Thank you.
All right, great job, Sienna. We are going to move now to our last speaker, Jordan Schmidt. So unfortunately, Jordan's mentor, Dr. Godwin Severa, the Hawaii Natural Energy Institute, couldn't make it today, but he asked that I share these comments. So Jordan has been a great student research assistant in our hydrogen storage and purification materials lab. She first joined our group as a volunteer, and her research is laying some of the foundational understanding we need to improve forward osmosis water purification technology for seawater desalination in Hawaii. Okay, Jordan.
All right, thank you, Dr. Guidry, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so as Dr. Guidry stated, or first let me introduce myself again. My name is Jordan Schmidt, and I worked with under Dr. Godwin Severa on my undergrad thesis on the focus of the evaluation of potential forward osmosis draw solutes for the purpose of seawater desalination. Oh, let me present this in Hawaii. And this will be kind of the layout of my presentation today. And to provide some brief context, the motivation for this research project stems from the prevalent issue of water scarcity. To give some insight, as you're probably familiar with, about 71% of Earth is comprised of water, but as you can see down here, only 0.5% of water is usable and available, meaning that the remaining 2.5% of fresh water is locked up in glaciers, soil, the polar ice caps, the atmosphere, or is just really heavily polluted and kind of unusable in that sense. So, and as you can imagine, water is really vital for survival and is heavily used for the production and transportation of agricultural, pharmaceutical, and technological goods. And as a result, this issue has been addressed by the outcrop of desalination plants. As you can see on the graph bar chart on the right, the number of desalination plants globally has grown tremendously from the 1960s in response. And to provide some further context, my research is on forward osmosis, but the more established membrane-based filtration method that has been used over the past multiple decades has been reverse osmosis. You might have seen this on your water bottles or on a hydration station as the primary method for purifying your water. And this method is membrane-based, like forward osmosis, where there is a semi-permeable membrane that it selectively allows pure water to flow through by the force of applied pressure. So pressure is applied to the left side, this draw solute side, and pure water is forced through, and only pure water is allowed through. But this method has is physically powered and has a higher likelihood of biofouling due to this pressure shoving these contaminants kind of in the near the membrane. And as this system is ran and the contaminants stick to the membrane more and more, the efficiency is just going to go down. And it has been shown that there's a potential for forward osmosis to have higher energy efficiency with a 30% higher rate of efficiency than reverse osmosis. So there's some context on that. So to lead you into more like the main difference between the two, forward osmosis is a chemically powered process where the feed water is on the left and naturally moves to the draw solution as the draw solution pulls fresh water through due to ionization and the osmotic pressure. And this is a relatively newer method, and it's kind of just been starting to gain traction in the last 10 years or so. And it does have the potential to be more energy efficient as lower pressure is required. As you can see in this diagram on the bottom, it shows like a schematic of a forward osmosis system, a really simplistic system with a seawater feed solution in this container, and then these tubing that introduces the water to the semi-permeable membrane, moving fresh water to the draw solution as the draw solution pulls the fresh water. There may be some pumps involved, but there's no like required pressure to get that water moving. It's a natural process that occurs in our bodies and plants, if you're familiar with Osmosis Jones and the human body's physiological systems. So due to the growing potential for more energy efficient methods of desalinization, my research focuses on determining and evaluating the best draw solutions for seawater desalinization using the forward osmosis process in a lab setting. So desalinization plants are large scale systems, but I'm testing these draw solutions in a very small scale lab setting. So on the left, this is the equipment that was used. It was provided by Dr. Severa. He had a student, I believe, assemble it once before, but no real experimentation happened to my knowledge. But I reassembled it with the help of my colleague, and he's a engineering grad student, and he helped with the connections. But we assembled this, and the main components, like I mentioned in the previous schematic of a draw solution system, are the feed solution, the draw solution on the right, and the membrane, which is in this acrylic membrane holder. So for my research and in my reference of forward osmosis, the feed solution is going to be on the left, but it really depends on the orientation of the membrane. So for my membrane, the active side is pointed towards the feed solution on the left. So it's always pointed toward the feed solution, but my feed solution just is on the left, but it's not always on the left. It's wherever the active side of the membrane is pointing. So I'm just clarifying that. And so the more secondary components of this system are the low pressure circulating pumps and the low pressure tubing. It's thick tubing, allowing for only a little bit of water to run through, so not to waste solution and chemicals. And then there are 2 flow meters to ensure that my flow pumps are set to identical flow rates. And then these pressure gauges just ensure that no pressure is building up and no like spouts or connections are going to be broken from that buildup of pressure. And then the precision scale I placed underneath the draw solution, as that's how my data is predominantly measured. So my data comes from this mass increase. As the system is running, the water will be pulled into the draw solution, and this will gain water and thus become heavier. So that's where my data will come from. This is just a quick look inside the membrane holder. So the membrane is placed before every experiment, and This is just the holder, and the membrane is very small and made of a polymer cellulose triacetate. And it's manufactured for the purpose of forward osmosis. And we purchased quite a few of these and didn't use all of them. But that's just to give you a look at what is going on inside. Let me go back really fast. So water will be introduced into this acrylic holder in these little compartments, and it'll continuously be circulating, introducing it to the membrane continuously. So like I mentioned, my research is focused on the testing of jaw solutes. Dr. Severa and I chose 3 chemical solutes based on the characteristics listed here. And this came from existing literature where they included what made a good potential jaw solute. So we took those into consideration, and we also took into consideration availability as COVID kind of affected our shipping times. So we were able to get these chemicals from the chemistry stockroom, and those were sodium chloride, potassium chloride, and ammonium chloride. So those were our 3 jaw solutes we tested, and all our ionic liquids. And the sodium chloride, as you could probably guess, is kind of the main component of seawater. So just to clarify, we chose sodium chloride as it kind of behaves as a standard for our testing, just to see how it interacts with seawater and just provide some insight. So our main testing really, I would say, was between the potassium chloride and ammonium chloride, as those have applicable uses after they've been ran through a forward osmosis system and diluted. They have potential to be used for other things. And we chose 3 different concentrations. So we made 3 concentrations of each class of chemicals. So in total, we had 9. I made 9 solutions, 2 liters of each, and those were 0.6 molar, as that's the approximate molarity of salt in seawater in Hawaii. And then we did 1 molar and 2 molar, just to make sure that it was below the max threshold of 6.16 molar, which is the max solubility of salt in water. So that was kind of our limit. And then for the data collection, we first tested each class of solutes. So those 9 concentrations I mentioned, we tested those with DI water feed for 1 hour. And from those 1 hour FO runs, I took the best performing concentrations of each class of chemicals and tested those with seawater feed solutions. So that's where this next phase of experiments is more of a lab-based desalinization. So this first phase of experiments is really just standards experiments and data, so that we can make sure that the system is running adequately, and it just gives us some insights. And it limited the amount of solutions we had to make, as these seawater runs were 5 hours instead of 1 hour. So really the main difference between the first phase and second phase of experiments was we used seawater as our feed. So we're pulling fresh water out of seawater instead of just pulling DI water out of DI water. And then we ran them for 5 times as long. Also, the seawater all was collected from Ala Moana Beach Park. And then, so for each experiment, the data was collected as the mass changed. So I would start the stopwatch, and every 5 minutes I would write down the mass. So it was all by hand, and there was a room for error, but for the most part, I was really on the dot. And if I didn't collect data right at the 5 minute mark, I would skip that and just add it on to the end. So you'll see in the graphs, it all made it up for itself. And then this is just a diagram to remind you of like what's going on with forward osmosis and the process of the water moving. Okay, and so here are our results of the DI water feed. So the graphs of the DI water feed experiments showing the mass increase with in respect to time. So we did it over 50 minutes, and the best performance of the sodium chloride draw solutions was 1 molar despite having the lowest initial mass increase. I did say that I chose the best performing draw solute from these DI water feeds for the desalinization, but for the sodium chloride, I actually tested 2 concentrations. I tested both 1 molar and 2 molar. So despite the 1 molar sodium chloride performing better, you'll see that that didn't really carry through with the saltwater feed solution, and you could probably guess that as seawater is predominantly sodium chloride, so to have something like of a similar concentration didn't really make sense. So I kind of took the initiative to just test the 2 molar concentration anyways, and then the 2 molar solution of the potassium chloride performed the best, so that I used that concentration for my seawater runs. And then for the ammonium chloride, the 2 molar solution performed the best as well. And then so from the time data and time and mass data that I collected, I ran it through this theoretical equation from an existing literature, and I got the water flux, and these are the graphs of those, and it just is providing the water flux, which is defined as the movement of water through the semi-permeable membrane flowing from the feed solution to the draw solution. So typically FO systems run for 5 to 10 hours, and like I mentioned, these were ran for 1 hour. So this is really just a snapshot, and that could be why some of them are really variant. Interestingly, potassium chloride was the flux in the DI water runs and the seawater were kind of the most variant. Yeah, these are just kind of show the movement of water and like the rate of that. So onto the forward osmosis experiments with seawater feed. They were performed identically to the DI water feed experiments, as I mentioned, just with an adjusted longer run and obviously a different feed solution. But the best draw solutions were tested, like I mentioned, the 2 molar NaCl, 2 molar potassium chloride, and 2 molar ammonium chloride. So I didn't include the 1 molar sodium chloride that I mentioned did better in the DI water runs because they performed so poorly. And that kind of is to be expected. It really did make sense, as the molarity of seawater is about 0.6 molarity, as I mentioned, and it was 1 molarity. So it was just a very gradual increase. And of the 3, as you could see, potassium chloride, 2 molars of potassium chloride performed the best with the greatest overall mass difference of 94.52 grams, followed by the 2 molar sodium chloride with an increase of 80.86 grams, then 2 molar ammonium chloride with a 77.46 gram increase. So the ammonium chloride and sodium chloride really did perform pretty similarly. And then, these were the water fluxes of the seawater feed. So the water flux trends for 2 molar sodium chloride and ammonium chloride for the seawater runs showed rapidly increasing initially, flux initially, then steadied, as you could see, to a slow decrease, which is what was expected. So we were we expected it to start higher and then steady out, but it started lower and steadied out. And this was, we gathered, due to maybe possible water left over in the tubing, because between every experiment we flushed with DI water. So that could have caused like a decline or like an initial slower water flux. But we were expecting, and other research shows that water flux starts higher and kind of dips down and plateaus. But the difference also could possibly be to polarization near the membrane, which is very common, but we're pretty confident it's from dilution. And then our basic conclusions show that the higher, and that does make sense. And the potassium chloride performed the best, which lines up with other existing research that potassium chloride is a pretty desirable or sought after draw solute for this kind of research. Like it performs really well and it has great application processes for like agriculture and fertigation, as well as ammonium chloride, but potassium chloride is really just performs so much better. And then the water flux performance of the best draw solutions were tested. And yeah, as I mentioned, potassium chloride did the best. And then so for improvements, we were very limited on time. Those 5-hour runs really were hard to schedule and find the time to do. And I think just the main improvement could have been to do just more testing and to kind of do like just check our work and make sure it all lines up and that there's consistency. And then investigating possible osmotic pressure polarization near the membrane. We said we could do that like during the processes, but it's kind of hard to do and like see when it's happening. But leakage was did happen. It wasn't a huge problem, but it could have been what contributed to some variability in the data charts. And then, like I said, running multiple and repeated experiments to determine limitations and just show more consistent data. And then like I mentioned, I was recording these mass amounts by hand. So hooking up the scale to a desktop could have allowed us to run these for longer than 5 hours and to have just more consistency. And then I would like to extend thanks to Dr. Severa for allowing me to have the opportunity to work in such a rigorous laboratory environment and I would like to thank my colleagues Trey and Colleen for their guidance in the lab and mentorship. And then lastly, a thank you to the care and support from the SOAS department and my GES. So, thank you.
Thank you, Jordan.
Very nice.
Congratulations,
Good
Jordan.
Great job, Jordan.
So Jordan, first, just to clarify, after 5
Can you say that again? My internet kind of cut out for a second.
Yeah, so Eleanor's question is to clarify, after the 5-hour run, was the water completely fresh?
No, so it would never, the water never got fresh. Like, I think it may have been confusing because in reverse osmosis, you're using a freshwater draw solute typically a lot of the time. But no, so the product is just diluted draw solution. So it's just more fresh water is diluting that draw solution. So it's just going to become more and more diluted. It's still going to have that chemical solution makeup, but with more fresh water added. So it's kind of like forward osmosis isn't really a purification, a primary filtration process, if that makes sense.
All right, other questions? Greg?
Yeah. Hi, so I was wondering if you could then explain, so you go from saltwater, seawater to a different salty solution. And
yeah,
then,
so
how do you then ultimately get to your freshwater?
Right, so what I gathered from all this research for forward osmosis is that it's not really a very like lucrative process for making pure water. It's kind of a method of taking a briny water or something that's kind of contaminated and just making it, pulling the good water out of it and diluting something else that can be applied, if that makes sense. So the end product on the feed solution is usually a brine, which has prevalent issues with desalinization. Like a lot of people are trying to figure out like what do you do with the brine, like that's an issue. But yeah, so you have an end product of the feed solution and then an end product of diluted draw, if that makes sense.
Okay, Jordan, I have a question for you. What's the biggest use of fresh water in the United States?
I don't know the answer, but I could guess like transportation. I know it consumes a lot of water, but I don't know.
Okay, it's irrigating crops.
Okay, yeah.
And that's true in most parts of the world. Now, the fact is we can desalinate seawater, and there are some places in the United States that are doing that. Tampa Bay is an example. Why don't, if fresh water is in short supply in some parts of the country, which is certainly true, why don't we just go ahead and desalinate seawater? What's holding us back?
Well, it's energy costly right now. A lot.
And how else is it costly?
I don't know.
Well, how about money?
Okay, yeah. Expensive, yeah.
Okay, well, do you know, I mean, if you own a home on Oahu or any place in the United States and you have tap water, you have to pay the board of water supply. You know that water is not free. Do you have any idea how much more desalinated water would cost you than tap water?
I'm sure more because
Well,
it has an extra
more,
process. Yeah.
But is it 10, 100? How much more costly is it?
Yeah, probably a lot more right now.
Okay, well, I think, some communities are actually doing this right now. So it's not prohibitive. Well, it's a factor of, I'm going to say 2 or 3, 4, something like that. It's not 10. So it does cost you more. Now, you mentioned earlier in your talk bottled water. So if you go to someplace like China, nobody drinks the tap water. It's not safe. Everyone drinks bottled water. Do you have any idea how much more bottled water costs you than tap water?
I don't know the proportion, no, but
Yeah.
more.
Okay, do you think it's more than drinking desalinated water?
No, well, no, maybe not what the process is now, but if with further like research and implementation of like processes to get to a more efficient process, it could be cheaper. I think that's the ultimate goal, is to figure out a way to get it cheaper, with waste heat or certain processes.
Well, okay, so you can get on the internet and you can look up the Board of Water Supply and see what they're charging you for water. And then you can certainly look at what Walmart or someplace like that will charge you for a bottle of water. It's about a factor of 1,000.
Okay.
So if you have lots of money, fine. But if you're buying bottled water, it's costing you about 1,000 times what it would cost you to turn on the tap and pour yourself a glass of water. Okay, Jordan, good job.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question and a comment. Jordan, nice job.
Thank you.
I picked up a couple of times in your presentations, you said, so we think this is what's occurring. We think this is that. Can you clarify a little bit about how scientific those statements were when you say we think? What did you base that on?
Well, based on existing literature, so that those are the most, like the issues I stated with polarization near the membrane. That's like the #1 issue, and in like data discrepancy, and it happens due to biofouling over time. So that it's based on things that have happened. It's just hard to determine if that's exactly happening in our system just without knowing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. This is just pointing this out for you and the rest of your colleagues. So we don't really say we think in science. But you can certainly reference the literature and say at the moment it is unknown, but based on the predominance of literature, we assume, or our hypothesis is this. You always want to present it. See, this is the way scientists get out of not knowing something. They turn around and they pose it as, well, this is a very interesting question to pursue, so let's write another grant. So you always want to have that, you always want to cage it that, present it that way, so it doesn't look like you're saying just we think, because that just sounds like you're throwing it out there.
Gotcha.
It's no problem to say the majority of literature to date is suggesting this. So this requires further investigation. And so that's the better way to present it. And that goes for everybody. Going back to what Ed said about the osmosis, I want to point out there's a couple of problems with desalination. One of the things that you said was, well, right now, and there's this assumption that maybe desalination can be made less expensive. And the reality of it is, no, desalination is a physical process of separating water from other molecules, okay? And this is based on, it gets down to pressure and size separation. And so there comes a point where there's a thermodynamic limit. And this has to do with all the van der Waals attractions between water molecules and the hydrogen bonding and everything else. That desalination is never going to get cheaper. It's not like we're going to find a different membrane, because thermodynamically there's a limit of how much energy you're going to have to expend to separate. The only way it gets cheaper is if your energy source is cheaper, and I don't think that's going to happen. Even I think renewable will always be more expensive from that. And then the other thing is that it may work for coasts, but the minute you're trying to water crops in the high plains of Colorado or Utah, or in the western, or in the eastern side of the Rockies, we're not going to be pumping water from the Gulf of Mexico or the coasts. It's just the size of the plants that we'd have to put in, the literal amount of land we would have to put in place to hold all of these membranes, which all have to be heated up, right? They have to operate at very high temperature. So all of these desalination plants are you go inside, it's very hot because they have to heat them up. That's already going to stop us from ever using desalination as a major solution. And then if you put them on the coast and the sea level rises, as Ed said, 20 feet, you've now sunk your desalination plant. So there's problems there. Water, fresh water, yeah, that's that is the hidden danger of climate change. Nice job. You did a really good job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Jordan, I want to follow up on a couple points that Mike made there. You may be aware that the Ogallala Aquifer, which runs from Nebraska down to parts of Texas, is the biggest aquifer in the United States by far, but we're guilty of overdrafting parts of that aquifer. So the Corps of Engineers actually looked into the possibility of moving water from other parts of the country to areas in Texas and parts north where the demand is for irrigation. And just as Mike said, it's prohibitively expensive. It doesn't make sense. So they do have a plan for that part of the country, but it involves water conservation. And one of the issues with water conservation is water is cheap. And so if you're a farmer irrigating crops, there's no economic incentive for you to use, for example, drip irrigation or subsurface irrigation, which is a lot more efficient than just spraying the water up in the air. However, if you go to a place like China, yeah, they're moving water big time from southern China to northern China. Hey, it's a communist country. Somebody makes a decision and it's happening. And that's because northern China has a lot of people and not enough water. But it turns out if you sit down with a pencil and paper and work it out, it's not going to solve the problem. And the Chinese are actually pumping the ground dry in northern China by irrigating crops in a non-sustainable way. And, you know, at some point, the water is just going to run out. It's provocative what's going on in that country and over 1 billion people.
You know, Ed, to add to that, someone has said water is cheap, and water isn't cheap. It's subsidized, and we think it's cheap. I like to always tell my students, you know, you all think water is fairly free, and you can go on to campus and you have a right to free water. And I always like to remind everybody, you don't have a right to water at all. You just happen to live in a place where the access is allowed because they're afraid of you rioting if you don't get it. But if you live in Cape Town, South Africa right now, or 2 years ago when they hit ground zero, you would realize suddenly access to water is not a human right. It's not a God-given right. So, as Ed pointed out, China is draining its aquifers. We're draining our aquifers. And climate change is moving where the water falls. And where the water's falling now are in regions where they don't have natural catchment systems. We don't have the natural rivers or dams to catch it. Because if water had fallen there for the last 100, 200,000 years, catchment systems would have eventually developed and humans would have lived there. But humans have built cities around where the catchment systems already were for the rain patterns we already had. We're moving the rain now. And I suspect until another Bush gets elected and decides to start a war and invade Canada so we can take over Canada, we're not even going to have access to the Great Lakes. We're going to have some very serious water issues. So your work is very useful, but solutions, as Ed points out, I believe, are going to have to be region, nation, county, city specific, and it will have to use a lot of conservation.
Well, just to follow up on a point you made there, Mike, turns out Hawaii has the highest average rainfall of any state in the nation.
It's on a Kauai. We can't catch it.
So we are fortunate. Louisiana is second, by the way.
Well, hopefully you keep all your wetlands down there so you can.
Yeah, no, they're unfortunately the sea level rise is taking care of those.
All right, well, thank you for all of our speakers today for sharing their research. Obviously the mentors too for their support of undergraduate research, and then everyone else that attended. This concludes our summer 2021 GES Symposium. So we will leave this open, but we'll stop the recording here. And thank you again for attending. Great job, all the speakers. Well done.